All right, today, level design pipeline. Let's do this. Once I get Windows out of my way here. Okay. So the pipeline, of course, if that term, you've probably heard that term a lot already. This is just the process that we use to make things. And there's no one right way to do this. Every company does this a little differently, but there are some surprising commonalities. And so we're just going to get into this. And a lot of this you've already been doing in like 245, 255 or whatever. So this will be kind of old hat to a lot of you. But we're going to talk about the pipeline specific to the craft of level design. So usually, okay, Rob Howard sits down to write to make a level, right? What is my process? That's an interview question you'll get, by the way. What is your process? How do you go about making a level? And if your answer is I just sit down and just dump things out of my head into Unreal, you're probably not going to get hired, right? It's important to have a process. So step one is the paper design, which does not have to actually be paper, of course, obviously. It could be done in MS Word or Illustrator, whatever, right? It just means you're designing outside of the engine, in a document or something like that. So the purpose of this is to focus on your large creative choices in a non-destructive manner, which means that if you need to make some big change, like you decide, I'm going to do Greek ruins. All right, Greek ruins is awesome. And then you learn after you sketch this out on paper that let's just say it's a student project, so we'll cast it in those terms, that you find out that there's no good Greek ruins assets on the asset store, and there's nothing that even comes close, and you just cannot do that. Well, okay, great. Now, but you see there's like a really awesome, sort of Aztec ruins kit, and they're like, okay, great. It's Aztec ruins now, right? You can make big creative changes on paper like that before you commit to like making your block out, to actually like doing scripting, and then all of a sudden you have to make a bunch of changes, right? But you've done all this work. So the paper design, I've heard some people say it's like a straw man, right? Which just is a way of saying it's something that you make so you can kind of beat up on it, right? Sort of critique it, right? That's a really useful aspect of the paper design. Once you get something out of your head and onto quote unquote paper, then we can begin making sort of critical changes. And we see this in other industries, of course, right? Like, I built a house here. One of the reasons why I took this job is so I can have the ability to actually build a house, which you certainly can't do in California unless you're like a billionaire. And one of the cool things about that process is how similar it is to level design in a lot of ways. You're given a blueprint, right? Blueprint is a paper design. It's what it is. And you can look at that and make these sort of big creative choices like, oh, fireplace over here, not in the middle. We want a loft here, knock down this wall. Obviously, once drywall is up and the wood frame is up, it's much harder to do those things. And so better to do it on paper. It's really the same idea, right? So lots of different things do this, not just games. Okay, so the most simplest paper design we can do, and sometimes depending on what the project is just an overhead map, a 2D overhead map that's annotated. This could also be an old school level design document that's like 100 pages. No one does that anymore. Right, that's almost. I can't imagine that happens much anymore. Usually, documents are pretty concise now. Okay, so we do have some different types of documents or sort of styles of documents that you would make in this stage. So um, if the game is sort of mission based, which when I say that I mean that there's kind of an existing game world there. Like you see this in open world games where like, you have a big open world map. That map really isn't changing, but you're going to be doing a lot of missions within that map versus, a game that, like the first Modern Warfare game, it's single player mode where you have the first level and that's its own world, its own map, it's distinct. You go to a second level and that has its own map, its own world, right? Kind of distinct. So when you're mission based, there's less emphasis on the map because the map exists. It's you're just putting content in it, and so you're really focusing on the logical progression of your gameplay, what's going to happen, why it should happen, that sort of thing. And you still may use like 2D illustrations to call out sort of key gameplay moments. Okay, so when it's like layout based, this is kind of what you'll be doing, what you just did for your death match here, where you're really trying to show in the paper design the layout of the space, right? So this is great for your traditional multiplayer or traditional kind of linear single player games. You even think about like even like Naughty Dog's games or whatever now, where it is like a game you kind of move through, an experience you move through. Being able to look at your proposed layout, even in simplistic terms, is helpful. Now, if it's single player or player versus enemy PVE, you're going to need to make a lot of call outs in this, and we'll look at some documentation examples here in a second, or maybe not in a second, but we will look at some documentation examples here. So it's not just words on a PowerPoint slide, but you're going to call things out, right? You're going to have an overhead map, and you're going to have like the letter A in there somewhere, and then where enemies might spawn. And so you'll look somewhere else in your document where it says A, enemies come from this closet, right? Or here's where a trigger happens, or here's where the key is for the door. You're going to need to annotate things so we can get some sense of how the level is going to play. Okay, so paper designs it's not a law. It's not a contract, right? Like these game levels can and do change quite a bit after you lay out the paper design. It's kind of what I was saying before about the paper design being, like a straw man, to use that term. It's really something, again, where you're getting it out of your head into some sort of thing, external thing that you can criticize and work against and look at, right? So yes, these things can and do change a lot. Okay, so now we've done our paper design work. Okay, so we've done that. We've gotten our approval, right? If it's in a class, you've gotten approval from, or at least feedback from myself or Brantley. If you're working for a company, you probably have some process where some supervisor looks at it and goes, looks good, right? At Cold Iron, we would do these meetings where everyone would kind of look at the paper design and offer suggestions. And usually what would happen is it'd be, this is good, go ahead and make it, but just do these things, make these alterations or whatever. So you do that, and now we move on to the white box. And this is, of course, what a white box can look like. So quick and dirty first draft of a level, and you want to get something in engine quickly. Okay, so you're typically going to use BSP or simple meshes, although I do find that BSP is used less and less, although people still use it. It's still an Unreal. I actually really like BSP. Lots of old school level designers like BSP. It used to be BSP is just how the game was made, period, right? Like if you play like an old Call of Duty game, most of that environment is BSP with like models, meshes that are kind of decorating it. Right now, we've moved away from that a little bit. So if you're not using BSP, you're using like in Unreal the cubes, the simple shapes, and you're kind of scaling them around to, or you're using 3D Studio Max or Maya. Sometimes you can do your blockouts there too. Now, when you're given decent tools to block out in engine, I always vastly prefer that. I hate jumping back and forth between programs and having to deal with like two different programs, sort of weirdness, right? I like to constrain things, but when I was working at Vicious Cycle, that game engine they used, which was called the Vicious engine, it was their own engine, that didn't have BSP capability or really any capability to do blockouts at all. Like you had to do it in Max, and Max was the program we used. So that does still, of course, happen. If you're super comfortable with Maya or Max, that's another reason why you would do that. You're just more comfortable doing that work there. Okay, so white box complexity. There's a lot of different philosophies to this. How many of you have seen Blocktober on Twitter? Hashtag Blocktober. A few of you, right? This is basically, it happens every October where people post blockouts, industry people, and not just industry people, but they do participate. And what always happens is like, you'll see these white boxes that almost look like they're final art. They just don't have textures on them. I mean, they're really complex. I mean, they're they're like, extremely intricate. I will tell you that that is not really the norm, right? That's an extreme end, right? They can be that way, but that's not how most of them are. A lot of it is, you're just scaling around a cube a bunch of times, right? It depends on what you need, right? So that kind of really intricate white boxing where it's like it looks almost like a finished art, just with it's just white or gray or whatever. That makes sense if you don't foresee having to change things a lot, because you're sort of going against the whole purpose of the white box when you do it that complex, right? Because now it becomes painful to make changes again because it's, geez, look at how complex this is, right? Now, this happens, I think, because there are a lot of level designers out there that either started their careers as environment artists, or they started at school as environment artists, or they were environment artists in the industry. This happens a whole lot. They take this career path and they decide at some point they like level design more, and they switch over. And so these are people that are just really comfortable making these things complex, right? And you see that a lot at some companies. I think this is definitely true of companies like Naughty Dog. The distinctions between the level designer and environment artist get real blurry, right? I mean, there's a real kind of gray area where someone is sort of like a level designer and sort of like an environment artist, and it just kind of lends itself to these really, really complex white boxes. Just know that's not necessary. If that's what you can do and you're comfortable doing it, okay, but it may not even be good for the project to be that complex. But when Blocktober rolls around, you'll see this. You'll see these incredible white boxes, and just know that's not necessarily necessary. Now, simple blocks, simple blockouts. Again, like I know lots of level designers that when they block out a level, they just take that cube in Unreal and scale it around a bunch. Okay, so the advantage of this is you get maximum flexibility here. So the thing about the white box I think is so important. I really do think this is key. Is art influences you, right? We take in, this is something that someone would have to, someone fact check me on this. This is something I heard a long time ago. I don't know if it's actually empirically true, but I'll say it because it makes beautiful sense to me that we take in 80% of our information visually. Now go fact check that. But I do think our eyes matter a lot, right? And so when we see something that, that looks good, we are going to think it's more fun, right? It's one of the reasons why I'm excited that the research I'm going to do is not going to involve arted up projects, because if the project looks incredible, that's kind of its own pleasure, right? It influences how we feel about the gameplay. So when we do a simple white box, that isn't really intricate, that doesn't have a lot of detail, I actually think that's really helpful because you can start, you're just not thinking about the art, you're only thinking about the gameplay, and it's maximal flexibility. Okay, so it's so much easier to move things around, make changes, be nimble. I think it's really important to be nimble when you make the white box, to have it not be this intricate house of cards that is going to collapse if one card is pulled away. I mean, you want to be able to shove things around, move it, because you're adjusting for gameplay, you're testing, and even from the earliest stage, before you do any scripting, you're going to be doing things like running around just to make sure it feels good, the flow feels nice, that there aren't weird things on walls that you're hanging up, or that, hey, I put a bunch of columns here, but it feels bad. Yeah, you have a question back there. So the question was that was just asked: is it possible to export a white box into Maya? Yes, you can totally do that. You can export as any of that stuff can be exported out of Unreal as an FBX. And that does that type of pipeline does exist. It does happen. Um, so yeah, I actually like this method of white boxing. And if you have great concept artists, they can look at these really abstract looking things and they can do paint overs and figure out what things are supposed to look like, which is really love you concept artists because you're a huge help in this. Okay, so you've done your paper design, you've done your white box, and now we're going to proceed to the first playable step. So for your projects here in this class, this is kind of like that white box 2 step, basically, is this first playable. And incidentally, this pipeline is just about every company I've worked at or work with does some version of this, right? Paper to white box to first playables. This is so standard. Okay, so basically what this is you have all the kind of minimum scripting required to play what it is that you're trying to make, but it's still white box art. Now, the scripting is going to be crude. It's not going to be completely polished. It's enough though that your intent, you can play your game, you can play your level. So it's still early enough that you can propose big changes. It's not going to be too painful yet. So this is still an area where you have a lot of flexibility. And what I find in my industry work, what ends up happening a lot is you bring lots and lots of stuff up to this point, right? Like as a level designer, you're cranking out all these things that go from paper, white box, first playable, paper, white box, first playable, and then these things all kind of then sit there, because you move on to the next thing. Because all the stages that come after first playable take a lot more time. So you sort of go back and you cycle through, and then you get this huge pile of things that are sitting at this stage, right? Now in this class, you'll take one of your 3 projects that you get to the state, and then you'll go through the rest of the process. So I would love it if we had enough time in this class for you to do that with all 3, but it would have to probably be a 1 year, not a 1 semester course for that. Plus, the thinking is if you learn how to take one level to a complete state, then you can go back if you want to take the other ones to that. Okay, so what would happen next theoretically? And just as a reminder, this varies at every company, right? This is an approximation. Usually you get into a design lock at some point. So what this means is that we have signed off on the design. So we decide, okay, we're really happy with how this plays. And we just don't mean the scripting elements. We mean the layout elements, like where all the blockers are, where all the cover is, everything, right? We've locked, the design is signed off on. So changes are really bad to do now, right? Because the whole point of something being in design lock is that we don't have to worry about it anymore, and we can focus on making it look good. We can art it up, we can optimize it, we can debug it, all these things. But let's be real, changes still happen here, right? Like it shouldn't, but it happens, unfortunately, and it's a pain, but it does happen. That's just the reality of game development. These processes are never followed perfectly. What's really great now is, at least in this kind of linear pipeline that I'm talking about, and again, there's other pipelines that exist where it's not quite this linear, but in this style of pipeline, this is typically when artists would start working on the level, because now they can trust everything, right? An artist can go in and be like, okay, I know that this gray cube in the middle of the room is not moving. The designer is not going to want it to move. They're not going to want it to change dimensions because it matters. But I am now free to make that a crate or a desk or whatever, right? And they can go in and kind of do their job and hopefully still collaborate with the designer, of course. Okay, so once we achieve design lock, we get to do art pass 1. And actually, just a interesting side note about that screenshot, that's one of my older levels. That's a Call of Duty 4 level that obviously I made them on my own. I never worked for Infinity Ward. And that's kind of old school, right? That is entirely BSP, basically, except for the balcony bits. Those are meshes. Obviously, the satellite dish is a mesh, the billboard. That's kind of the old school style, how levels used to be built, is you would build like fairly complex shapes, like even the arches, that's BSP, all that stuff. The car isn't, but like all that, all BSP with textures, and then you kind of decorate it with meshes. And also in the old days, level designers would participate in the art a lot more than they do now. So Art Pass 1, probably called something else at whatever studio. And of course, it can be done a million different ways. So now you're working with the environment artist to make the level look good because it's locked down design-wise. So how that happens is really up to the individual company. You can sometimes, as you pointed out, or you asked about earlier, I mean, the whole thing can be exported to Maya. and then they just go to town in Maya, right? That can happen. Uh, Sometimes there's the use of a modular or semi-modular kit, and the artist takes that kit, individual meshes, what I mean by that, and they bash it together. We call that kit bashing, very common thing to do. For our class, when you pick your project to take to this stage, really what you'll be doing is focusing on structural things. So this is, okay, I'm going to make sure that walls, ceilings, floors all have materials on them now, that they are, proper static meshes, or at least they have a good looking material. We're not worried at this stage about the small props, things like if we're doing this classroom, and I'll try to describe it for statewide people, it's just a typical classroom. You would worry about, like, again, the floor, the walls, the ceiling, but you would not necessarily worry about the desks yet. That would come later. So you're really just focusing on structure at this point. Okay, so now we get to Art Pass 2. And this is a good friend of mine. This is his work on Recore, where he was an environment artist, Kip Carbone. Great showpiece there, great lighting, really shows his style. He has a really great, I think, clean aesthetic. Love working with Kip. Some of his work, a lot of his work is in the Aliens game. That's where I worked with him. So Art Pass 2. Okay, again, probably called something else at whatever studio, For our purposes, though, this is our polished stage here. So, we've taken our level, it's in design lock. We have, done a structural art pass on it. Now we're going to do the detail work. Now, again, to use the classroom as the example, we're going to put in the desks, the chairs, right? The little document thing on my lectern. Maybe the whiteboards, right? Everything else that you need would happen here. Lighting, visual effects, and all the little polishy details, decals, right? Signage. All those things happen now at this point. And there may be, you could theoretically have art pass 2, 3, 4, you can have many, many different passes. So we're kind of compressing some things here. But generally, you're going to have multiple art passes to get something from kind of a rudimentary state to a polished state. And a really good example of this that happened here at Purdue was when I was helping to run the virtual labs. Yes, it was called virtual labs. I'm starting, my memory is already fading on that. It's been a year. When we were doing the virtual labs project, which is a Purdue initiative to use game dev technology to recreate mechanical engineering labs. It was just a classroom, right? And most of the scripting and work was just in replicating the lab experiment. But it was really fascinating watching the students iterate on the look of the room and just the look of the game in general, and watching this process play out, right? Because we got it all done and we got it all basically roughed in. But then I'm like, okay, now let's tweak these things. Let's make this thing a little better. Let's make this lighting a little better. And and we would do this in passes every couple of weeks. We'd do another pass. And just, if you looked at the little classroom from the first kind of feature complete stage we got, and you look at it after multiple art passes were done, it's like night and day. And what I think the students learned from that is game development isn't this thing where you sort of work, ding, it's done, like a pizza out of the oven. It's more like you work, stop, assess, think about what you did, and kind of collect data, and then apply that, work more, stop, assess, look at what you did, apply the data, work. It's iterative, right? And you kind of build things in broad passes that way. And it was cool to see that with students happening kind of before our eyes. Yeah, the question was like, what other names have I heard? Things being called. I mean, honestly, what I actually recall, my memory is basically just Art Pass 1, Art Pass 2. I'm just saying it's probably called different stuff. Just because there's no like this is there's no one way that all companies make things. There's always going to be a little bit of variation, but the overall process is quite similar. And I think it's quite similar for good reason. And that reason is because when people have tried to to sort of cut some of these steps out, right? Because you do see this happening. I've seen this happen on projects I've worked on where you want to shortcut. Like a one shortcut that happens sometimes is people will make a complete art ready kit of something, right? Like the pieces, the static mesh pieces are fully arted, fully materialed, ready to go. And they give the level designer these pieces as like Lego pieces, and just make the level. And once they snap everything together, it looks art complete, right? And you've totally eliminated the white box process. Well, in my professional experience, what that causes is a lot of pain, because the gameplay has not been worked on, it has not been iterated on, it has not been figured out, and inevitably that shows up to bite you on the rear, and everyone's wondering why these levels aren't fun. It's because that wasn't focused on, right? And then what ends up happening is the painful going back to like either scrap things or heavily revise. And that's where I've really learned throughout my industry career that it's really bad to start with art complete assets early, because art is so influential. Like you can build something that looks cool and people will think it's fun in the first like 5 minutes they play something, but then when you do your weekly play tests at the companies you're working at and you're looking at this content again and again and again, it's like suddenly you realize it's fake. You haven't really worked out the gameplay. It just looks cool, and that's not enough, right? So that's why I say different companies may call this stuff different things, but we almost always fall back on this type of process because it works really well. And my CGT 105 students will know that this doesn't even come from this process. Actually, kind of originated with pinball machines. They do exactly the same thing for pinball machines, right? They do it on paper. They design it on paper. They actually have a stage where they build a pinball machine out of just like plain. They call it a whitewood, not white box, but whitewood, right? So you see other industries do this, and it just makes sense. It's a good, solid, sturdy foundation in which to build things upon. Okay, so what I'm going to do now that we're through this is I'm going to share some examples that I have here. So let me fire up my OneDrive here. Okay, so this is an example of a kind of mission-based document. Let me enlarge this because I know it's really small right now. If I can, maybe I'll have to just download it if it's not going to behave. I'll just do that. Okay, so as you can see, this doesn't have like, if I look through this document here, it has a flow chart. It does not actually have a map, right? And that's because this was a Fallout 3 design document. Now, you'll say, Rob, I've been to your portfolio. I've looked at your resume. You did not work on Fallout 3. You lying liar that lies. Well, okay, let me explain what this is. This was my design test to get hired at Human Head Studios. They were like, hey, design us some Fallout 3 levels, right? Missions, whatever. So a lot of what I have as example documents are things that either I was able to use successfully to get a job, or they're things I even developed on the job as like design tests and things. So they all have industry relevance. But that's why it's like a Fallout 3 level when I did work on it. Very common, by the way, design testing in interviews, in sort of hiring processes to be asked to like make things for some other game that's already out. So you can see, I mean, I'm summarizing the premise. I will post this on Brightspace, actually, or yeah, I'll post this on Brightspace later, since we won't have enough time to go through this bit by bit here. But you'll see, since the map layout already exists theoretically, because this is totally make believe here, it was more important to show the logic of how this mission worked. That's why I did this flow chart, to kind of show the logic of how this particular mission would play out, right? And I annotated, this was the fact that the number 2 here is different. That has to be some weird artifact of the fact that it's now a 10-year-old document. So obviously this sort of thing you should not do. Have things look consistent. I have no idea why that's that way. Probably was not that way when I did it 10 years ago. But yeah, I'm just describing here just beat by beat, how this plays out. And one of the things I want you to get from this is like my use of lists and bullets, right? Lists and bullets are really good for documents, for design documents, because they're so much easier to kind of read for the viewer now, the reader. Now, I do plenty of big chunks of text, especially because this is a story-based thing. So yes, I do have a big chunk of text here. But in general, I always like to suggest to people, break things into lists, whether it's a numbered list or a bulleted list. It just kind of makes things easier to understand. So that's kind of this style of like the mission style of document. And some of this stuff, by the way, are things they specifically asked me to do. Like I'm pretty sure this 3 pros and cons thing, this is something they put in their design test. They go, tell us 3 pros and cons of the implementation of your level, right? They're trying to get me to think critically about my design. So I'm pretty sure this was only in here because they asked me to put it in here. So I do a very rough map just to show just the overall scale of the environment, but it's really simple, really simple. So unlike your, hopefully this is much simpler than your deathmatch maps would be. So this would be kind of like that mission style that I talked about. Let's at least look at 1 or 2 more before we call it a day here. Get out of my way, WebEx controls. Okay. So if I let's look at my cold iron design test. And again, same kind of idea, although it's a little bit more like a linear action game level sort of document. And by the way, you'll recognize this because this document is the basis of the documentation templates I give out to all of you. This is literally what it's based off of, is this. Because not only was this like a successful design test for me to get to Cold Iron Studios, but like it actually then kind of became something that we used, as a template, I believe. So, then I brought it to Purdue with me, and so I really like it. That's why I have you all use it as a template. But this is kind of where that started. So that document that a lot of you have already filled out a few times, this is kind of its birth. And so, yeah, kind of this level, again, you're going to recognize a lot of these things. Level summary, where I describe the narrative element, and then I kind of go into the detail of the actual gameplay. And so here would be a much more complex level map because I'm really trying to describe a linear action game experience. So I'm annotating where enemies appear. Of course, there's a map key here. I'm calling out in the case of this, like what a specific structure looks like, because I think it's important enough to call that out. And I also have this little call out here of kind of what this center area would look like from the sides. Again, I thought that was really important to point that out there. So all kinds of information, right? Like the location of the treasure chests. I think that was like a design test component they had, is like there's 2 treasure chests, where do they, where are they placed? And so on. And then what I do is I, again, talk about the level here kind of in a blow by blow, like beat by beat way, right? Like with these lists, part A, part B. And again, I'll put this up on Brightspace also. And then, this last part is just what you're doing is you're really just grabbing images from the internet just to sort of say, hey, this is kind of how I think the level should look, right? Based on various things. All right, so one more minute. Is there something else I want to show here before we adjourn? Let me take a quick look. Maybe we'll look at, because it's a little bit more germane to what you're doing right now, this one. And this was for a design test I did for, I'm actually remembering the company. They're in Georgia, not the Killing Floor folks, the other big game developer in the Atlanta area. They do a very colorful Greek mythology MOBA game. Yes, you got it. Yeah, that's them. I did this for them. Obviously, I didn't get the job, but I thought it was a cool doc, so it's in the examples here. So this would be like a multiplayer, like Counter-Strike sort of thing. You have your bomb locations, you have a map that's really meant to show you the layout of this. Again, this would be kind of what a multiplayer document might look like. Okay, so, and again, same idea at the visual references at the end. As you can see, it's simpler than a single player document because really all the information you're trying to get at here is in the map because the gameplay is known, right? This is for a known game mode within Counter-Strike, and so therefore there's less that you have to explain generally. Okay, we are done. Thank you very much. I'll see you all later.
See ya. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, I apologize to statewide folks if you had questions in the chat because I realized I didn't look at the chat. Right, that was High Res. High Res was the company in Georgia. So that yeah.
No. We didn't have